So we've talked about the failure of the strike at Homestead in Pennsylvania. But I'd like to suggest that there's a little bit more going on here than I've discussed, and I'd like then to kind of wrap up what's happening with labor and the labor movement. America, the United States, underwent consistently through the 19th century a series of financial collapses, or sometimes we call them panics. There had been, if you recall, a financial panic in the 1870s, specifically 1873, that led to a depression, an economic depression. And it was partly because of that depression that you see the strikes occurring that you do in 1877. Well, there's going to be another financial panic, a major panic, 20 years later. Often these things went on that kind of 20-year cycle, it seemed, but 20 years later in 1893. And it turns out that this panic of 1893 is one of the worst economic depressions experienced in the United States, certainly up to the Great Depression that we'll see in the 1930s. But in early 1893, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad went bankrupt. They had borrowed heavily, and they had seen profits begin to dwindle. That bankruptcy would lead to a sort of chain effect as the collapse of this railroad sort of rippled through the American economy. To boost manufacturing in the late 1880s and into the 1890s, manufacturers had borrowed heavily and invested heavily in new machines. That's where your advantage lay. It was, if you're going to put money into your business, put it into new, innovative, and efficient machinery. Machinery that can help you rely less on skilled laborers, less on traditional methods, and more on unskilled labor. People who will, of course, sell you their time, not their skill. But during the first 4 months of 1893, 28 banks failed. By June of that same year, 128 banks had failed. In the course of 1893, 16,000 businesses across the United States went bankrupt. And many of those firms that had invested so heavily, thinking that the economy would continue to grow and grow and grow, found themselves with banks closing, unable to repay loans that were being called in. They found themselves having to close their own doors, having to lay off or unemploy workers as demand for products declined. Grover Cleveland, President of the United States, warned, quote, "We are on the eve of a very dark night." 1893 to 1897 would mark the worst years of the worst economic depression that Americans had yet experienced. As banks closed, gold reserves began to dwindle. As customers and savers went to try and get their deposits out of the banks prior to the banks closing their doors. By 1895, these closings had resulted in a sort of psychology of fear over the American economy as panic spread. It grew to a point that Grover Cleveland was forced to deal with no less a figure than financier J.P. Morgan to try and keep the American government afloat financially. The Depression of 1893 checked the rapid business expansion of the United States, but it also began to reveal the extent to which the various sectors of the American economy were tied now. It wasn't just iron and steel, it wasn't just the railroads, it wasn't just agriculture, but in fact all elements of the American economy were bound together. Labor and farmers, however, took the brunt of the financial downside, the brunt of the financial collapse. Granted, there were companies that went bankrupt. Granted, there were investors and financiers who lost their shirts. But across the board, it's the worker, the factory worker, it's the farmer who ultimately takes the brunt of what comes down the pike economically. And that leads us then to the story of the Pullman Strike. To tell you or give you a little bit of background, you may be familiar with the Pullman car or the Pullman Porter. These are sleeping cars, and they'd become a regular staple in American railroads, and in fact, railroads across the world. And they would, before it was all over, not too long ago, saw a show on the Orient Express, and they mentioned the Pullman cars that were part of that train. Well, George M. Pullman had located a model company town to house his workers close to his plant just outside Chicago, Illinois. And we keep sort of coming back to Chicago. This was an amazing town, and I think it's fair to say that many of the workers who worked at Pullman's plant actually lived in conditions that most Americans had never experienced. They had access to running water, they had nice streets, they had, among other things, libraries, access to education. There were just a lot of amenities. But it is notable that these same workers, rather than receiving housing for the work they did, paid a regular rent. There were costs to living in Mr. Pullman's model town. Well, in 1893, with the horrific financial collapse going on, there were new waves of wage cuts, layoffs, and strikes affecting the United States. 1894 saw more violence and more unemployment than had been seen in the United States for quite some time. Pullman's factory that produced these sleeping cars experienced kind of similar characteristics, wage cuts. But what the workers didn't get once their wages were cut were significant discounts or reductions in the rents that they were paying for company housing and for other amenities. In steps another organization, the American Railway Union, which was headed by a figure we'll come back to a little later named Eugene Debs, D-E-B-S. Debs and the American Railway Union were frowned upon by the older brotherhoods of the American Federation of Labor as being perhaps a bit too radical. Now, the reason the American Railway Union becomes important to what's happening at Pullman, which is where rail cars are produced, is because Debs convinces the union to vote to refuse to handle Pullman cars if management at the Pullman plant doesn't agree to arbitration of the workers' complaints. When George Pullman rejects arbitration or negotiation, when he rejects meeting with the railway union or other unions as representatives of the people, the workers, and rejects the notion of collective bargaining, he goes a bit further. In fact, when he rejects this reaching out for negotiation, he goes ahead and dismisses switchmen. These are men who change the track directions by moving switches. He dismisses switchmen who had boycotted his cars on the railroad. Moving freight, moving the cars out. As members of the American Railway Union, these switchmen had slowed down the process, had refused to handle Pullman cars, blah, blah, blah. Next thing you know, they're losing their jobs. By the end of June 1894, nearly all railroad workers west of Chicago were on strike. This is no longer a state issue where we're talking about state militia. It's not for local authorities, but very clearly it's a situation in which federal authorities will be stepping in most likely. And indeed, that's what happens. There had been little or no violence in this strike. What had happened was simply a refusal to handle goods, to handle the Pullman cars. Railroad managers across the United States, particularly east of the Mississippi, appealed to the federal government to intervene. Lawyers persuaded President Cleveland, and remember, he'd been engaged with finding funds to keep the government going and had spoken to major American businessmen who gave that money. Nonetheless, Cleveland was persuaded that his intervention was constitutional, indeed was justified, because the matter was a matter really of interstate commerce, but more specifically, the matter of the strike was a matter of the United States mails. At least that was the rationale that was given. That if railroad workers would not handle Pullman cars, and if their refusal was tying up America's railroads and stopping the movement of traffic, then the mails weren't getting through. And since one of the things constitutionally the United States government is responsible for doing is movement of the mails, Cleveland believed he had a right to act. Actually, here's the interesting thing. Railroad companies could have moved the mails simply by detaching Pullman cars from the trains. They could have built mail trains. They chose not to do this. The political fallout, ultimately, however, for the unions was that Grover Cleveland, on July the 4th of 1894, sent 2,000 U.S. troops to Chicago to enforce an injunction against the Union. At that point, when those troops arrived, the unions lost control of what had ultimately been, or what had really been, a rather peaceful strike. Looters began destroying Pullman cars. 12 people were killed, many more were arrested. The strike was broken. We see one more incident worthy of mention here. And that's, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it's Coxeys Army. This was a movement by a businessman from Ohio, Jacob S. Coxey. And as the Depression filtered down broadly to people in their lives, he began to protest the government's policies, especially things like the gold standard. He wanted to see policies in place by the government that were designed to affect those who had been affected by this economic downturn and were being affected by the broader changes taking place in the American economy. Paper money that wasn't inherently backed by gold, its valuation wasn't based on that. Coxey also called for versions of federal works programs. In other words, that the federal government would undertake efforts to find employment for people or create employment for people, to generate new consumer spending and also to relieve unemployment. Coxey's idea was to publicize his sort of platform, his goals, by leading a march on Washington. And this is kind of fascinating, right? Because we hear that term again. We'll hear it, interestingly enough, very early in World War II, when an African-American gentleman by the name of A. Philip Randolph, speaking to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, says that if there are not fair standards put into place governing defense contracts and issues of race, Randolph will lead a march on Washington. A march to raise awareness of the racial prejudices at work in federal policy and in industry. But what makes this connection kind of fascinating here is that Coxey's 1890s march on Washington that we see kind of threatened here in 1941, well, in the case of A. Philip Randolph, he is the leader, a representative of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Pullmans. And there's another instance where we see this notion of a march on Washington arising. And you and I, you've heard enough history to know that I'm probably talking here about the March on Washington, in which Martin Luther King Jr. gave his great speech, "I Have a Dream." The response to Coxey's march was sad. Not among the people. It was joined by marchers all along the way as he made his way from Ohio toward the nation's capital. There were women, there were children. On April the 30th, going back to 1894, Coxey enters Washington with some 500 people. And they approach the Capitol building. They vault over the Capitol walls, approach the Capitol steps, and police move in to scatter the crowd. As Coxey spoke or sought to spoke from the Capitol steps, he was dragged away amid arrests and clubbings. Well, there are a number of things I hope you've been able to see in this sort of group of segments, all part of this labor in the underclass. One, I hope you get a sense of how some Americans were affected sort of negatively by the changing economy of the late 19th century. I hope, too, that you've had a sense, perhaps, of where their frustration comes from. Frustration that will lead to labor unrest and ultimately to the construction, the organization of labor unions and collective action. But I also hope you get a sense, and you're welcome to argue about this if you will, I mean, that's part of history. But I hope you get a sense that there's a pattern that's laid out here in the late 19th century, and it's the rare exception when government uses its power on behalf of workers as opposed to the owners of property. That's the exception in the late 19th century. Something to think about as we approach discussions later on of the New Deal and civil rights. Thank you.